Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, can Governor Wes Moore lead the Democratic Party after loss to Trump while Maryland is facing a $2.7 billion deficit? Now that term limits are in effect, who will run to succeed Marc Elrich as county executive? Better question, who isn't running to succeed Marc Elrich as county executive? And President Donald Trump's cabinet appointments are all over the place. Is there a spot in Trump world for Larry Hogan? Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by the Secretary of the Maryland Republican Central Committee, Mark Uncapher, and former County Council member and CEO of SkillSmart, Mike Knapp. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. On Election Day 2024, several political milestones were achieved, one of which was the passage of an amendment to the county charter that restricts the number of terms that the county executive can serve from 3 to 2 terms, thus eliminating a third term for the current county executive, Marc Elrich. Yet, in typical fashion, the pugnacious county executive didn't take this as a vote from the populace or the vote from the county. He took it as an attack from his perceived political opponents and vowed to complete his progressive agenda in the next 2 years. In addition to castigating his local opponents, Mr. Elrich vowed to challenge the Trump administration and the Republican Congress whenever possible. He didn't really specify in his statement what that was. But Mike, what challenges from the Trump administration and the federal government is Elrich talking about? Councilmember Kristen Mink actually released her statement that Montgomery County will work with the state to protect all our people. We may need to refuse to cooperate with the federal criminalization of abortion, trans health, etc., the way we have for undocumented residents. Are we at war with the federal government?
Well, according to Councilmember Mink, I don't know. I think that the current county executive can find lots of boogeymen out there. And I think that it will be important to see what the federal government does. I think there will be, if passed as prologue, there's likely to be reduction in federal funds that will come to Montgomery County or come to the state of Maryland. And I think that's going to be a real issue that's going to need to be addressed. But I think that, as you indicated, the county executive wants to pursue his progressive agenda, but I'm not sure what that agenda is. I've not really seen much of an agenda. And so I'll be really curious to see what the next 2 years hold, other than kind of lashing out at folks and trying to get back to people who he thinks are on the other side of his issue. But I'm not sure what his issues really are, other than continuing to be kind of the NIMBY person that he is.
Well, NIMBY is a good term for Mark because that's sort of his base. But I think higher taxes is his agenda. Mark, was it surprising that so few Montgomery County politicians came to fight the term limit initiative this time?
Well, I initially was surprised about that, and then I kind of thought it through that, the more attention this issue seems to get, the more popular it becomes. Obviously, we all went through what happened when the council faced term limits, and that was passed overwhelmingly. So there wasn't a big campaign other than getting it on the ballot in favor, and there wasn't a big campaign against it, and it passed pretty decisively.
Mm-hmm. And this question is for either one of you. When Mark first won his first term, there were 11, 12 candidates running for that office in the Democratic primary, and there doesn't seem to be a lack of people who have expressed an interest. Who's the early betting favorite on this? And I'll start with you, Mark, and then we'll go to Mike on this one.
Well, I one of the downsides, I think, to term limits is that it creates for those who are, quote, termed out, who cannot run again for reelection, an incentive to run for higher office, to run for county executive. And so literally everybody who's in that position ends up coming forward. And part of the dynamic that then creates is this sense of, well, if 25% of the primary vote could end up coming on top, or some small percentage, it incents people to think that their base could be enough to make the difference. And so as a result, you end up having a sort of a lot more candidates than you might otherwise have. That I'm not answering your question because I think
Well,
that's
I
that
noticed
sense
that.
of that the pie gets cut so many different ways makes it very hard to predict.
So, Mike, Adam Pagnucco has done some really interesting analysis of, of the races, but also of, the differential between, what was made a successful candidate in Marc Elrich and what didn't. It was maybe a couple hundred votes here, a couple thousand, or one extra candidate in the race. So, who will inherit the coalition that Marc successfully put together as you said, the NIMBY coalition?
I don't think anybody puts that coalition together. I think that was kind of a uniquely Marc coalition that was cultivated over his time on the Tacoma Park City Council, and when he ran for at large, he spoke to a number of folks who didn't really want to see change, didn't want to see growth in their backyard, and that kind of cultivated an array of folks. So I don't know that anybody inherits that specifically. I know there's some notion that somehow that's a progressive block. I don't believe that it really is. I think there are some progressives in that, but I think that pretty much everyone is up for grabs, and I think every part of the county is up for grabs. There's been significant demographic shift. If you look at some of the polling that was done going into this election, you have nobody with less than 70% identification. I mean, nobody knows anybody. So I think that the most favorable person I saw was I think Will may be at like 11%, but there's nothing that indicates that anybody has any name recognition or has any particular block that is their block. And so I think in the coming weeks and months, you're going to see a lot of shifting and people trying to try out different messages.
Well, what it sounds like is that whomever can raise the most money to get name recognition may have a great opportunity here.
I think the other issue is what is your message? I think if the message is I'm more progressive than the other person and that's all I'm bringing to the table, I don't know that that's particularly resonant. I think that people if there's anything to take from the election, I think a couple of weeks ago, is that I want to see something different. I want to see some substance. I want to see us moving in a direction. I want to see some activity. And I think that for us just to be on the other side, for a candidate just to be on the other side of where they perceive the current administration to be, or to be the most progressive person in the room, I'm not sure that all the voters in Montgomery County are going to do that, are going to get there for that.
Well, the problem is, and Marc, I'll let you have the last word on this, is that, in the Democratic primary, the progressives dominate. How do you make that change?
Well, it's interesting. We obviously had some very closely the last two primaries were very closely contested with Blair. The first time I think he ran more as a centrist. The second time I think he kind of tried to straddle centrist and being more progressive and it was a little confusing towards the end. That said, Blair did lay out a more centrist approach, and if all the council members are fighting to be the most progressive, that may well create an opening for somebody who's a little bit more in the middle.
Well, that sounds like Andrew Friedson to me. Anyway, we got to go on to our next topic, and that's about Wes Moore. Last summer, after President Joe Biden announced that he was withdrawing from the presidential race, there was a bit of a flurry of activity, putting forth the name of Governor Moore as a possible replacement. Now, in the aftermath of the Republican victory, the drumbeats of support for Governor Moore are growing. Local papers, the Baltimore Sun, seem to be championing the idea that Governor Moore is the next Democratic star destined to be president. But Marc, like many other Democratic governors, Moore worked hard for both President Biden and then for the ultimate nominee, Vice President Kamala Harris, after the convention. But to suggest that a barely one-term governor should run for president seems like kind of a tall order.
Well, yeah, but this is the nature of hometown crowd, and I guess they probably look at, let's say, Tim Walz, and lightning strikes under the right circumstances, and there is A and B. There's really no clear favorite for the Democrats in 4 years. There's probably going to be a lot of people running, so I who knows. That said, I think you said it at the outset, and we're going to talk about it in more detail. Governor Moore has a big hurdle he's got to navigate before he can be presidential, which is how does he deal with this $2.7 billion deficit? And is it going to be taxes? Is it going to be cuts? How is he going to deal with the legislature? And it remains to be seen how he'll get through that.
So, Mike, I'm going to use a sports analogy here to open up the question. Commanders quarterback Jaden Daniels looked like an all-pro when beating up on the New York Giants, but he's exposed as rather pedestrian when you come up against the Philadelphia Eagles. So Governor Moore has, he's very telegenic and he's got good political instincts, but in comparison to Gavin Newsom or Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and Michigan's Gretchen Whitmer, he's going to have to deal with some heavy opponents here.
Sure. No, I think that's right. I think you underestimate Jaden Daniels a little bit. I think he's still going to be, by the end of this season, we're going to see that he actually is the real deal. I think to have a step, I'm not even saying last night was even a setback. I think the Eagles are a good football team and they showed that. So we'll see where that all plays out. Nevertheless, sure, I think there's going to be a lot to be shown and a lot to be done in the coming years. I think the notion of him being a first-term governor, the president-elect had no government experience when he was elected the first time. President Obama had been a state senator. I think we see lots of indications in recent past where necessarily having been in what would have typically been a traditional pathway and having done that for a while successfully is your path forward. I'm not sure that the people necessarily care about that as much as they once did. So I don't think that that's going to be the issue. I think the issue will be, how do people start to emerge? What are the characteristics that they can identify that they've been successful achieving? I think certainly the budget deficit that Governor Moore is going to see is going to be challenging. There are going to be some difficult things. And I think if we see fewer dollars coming from the federal government as a result of the current administration, I think that adds to the challenge. And I think the real focus is going to be is how does he lead Maryland to regenerate economic growth that we've not seen a lot of in the last 4 or 5 years?
So going back to Mark, this budget issue, this $2.7 billion deficit, it's an issue that Governor Moore has to deal with because he prepares the budget that's submitted to the General Assembly, but he also has to rein in the impulses of the General Assembly. And has he shown an interest in doing that?
I think it's fair to say that largely we have kicked the fiscal can down the road, in part because of the COVID relief money. We had more flexibility for the last couple of years in being able to fund things, and have been moving money from one year to another. That's really about to hit, and that's going to be the challenge that both he and the legislature are going to face. And you're right. I mean, if you remember this year, the legislature, there was a real split between the state Senate and the delegates as to how to handle it. And it'll be interesting how that plays out in next year, and also how the governor comes out in that whole equation.
Well, the albatross around our neck is, I don't know, is it Kirwan or Thornton, or which educational non-funded educational plan are we dealing with, Mike? I'll let you have the last word.
No, I think that's going to be the issue we're going to have to address, is how do we manage through the blueprint and try and chart a path forward for Maryland schools in a way that can be cost effective and allows us to be successful. And I think that's going to be the real challenge. And I think people's going to have propensity, and you alluded to this in the county executive, and I think with the governor, to look at taxes. And I think there are going to be enough other changes out there that for people to jump to taxes this year, I think puts us in a real bind, because I think it limits flexibility to address the challenges that we don't yet know. And
well, here's one challenge. They want to knock down the Bay Bridge and build 2 brand new spans across the Chesapeake Bay. Who's going to pay for that bad boy? When we come back from this short break, President Trump's cabinet appointments, well, I guess you could say they're all over the place. And is there a spot in Trump world for Larry Hogan? Stay tuned.
Jordan knows he shouldn't eat this entire bowl of nachos, but tonight he's earned that right. Because a few hours ago, in the middle of happy hour, he recognized a sign. Not from the gods or a bolt of lightning, but from a double heart, a kissy face, and a fourth ha in ha ha ha. That's when Jordan knew he was buzzed. So when it was time to go, he got a ride home instead of driving. Be a legend like Jordan. Recognize your buzzed warning signs and get a ride home. Buzz driving is drunk driving.
Welcome back. Within days of being recognized as the winner of the 2024 presidential contest, the 47th President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, began releasing the names of his top political advisors and cabinet officers. The initial response was rather muted. Susan Summerall Wiles' appointment as the first female chief of staff was well regarded. And then things got a little weird. It was no surprise that former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley would not have a role, but was so publicly rebuked, along with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, a Trump loyalist in the eyes of many who would not have a role in this Trump administration. And the initial release of names, Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, Congressman Michael Walz as National Security Advisor, John Ratcliffe at CIA, all fit the mold of serious individuals for serious jobs. And as I said, things got a little weird. Fox Media anchor Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, Kristi Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for Head of Health and Human Services were all head scratchers, but somewhat justifiable. But the one that turned the nomination process, and I hate using this phrase, into a clown show was the nomination of Congressman Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. Political commentator Eric Erickson described the Gaetz nomination as a brilliant political move by President Trump. It removes Gaetz from Congress, where he was despised by both parties. It saved Gaetz from having the House investigation made public. And since it's doubtful that Gaetz can be confirmed by the Senate, it eliminates Gaetz as a political problem for the president in Florida in the future. Does all of that make sense?
Well, it is also a kind of a distraction strategy on the part of Trump. I mean, I'm fascinated to watch the poly markets, the futures market, which does predictions as the chances that Gaetz will be actually confirmed, and it seems to drop hour by hour. I don't think there's any chance that he will be confirmed, but of course, it does distract the conversation from some of the other nominations that, as you've mentioned, it could well have generated a lot more controversy. So think of Gaetz as being something of a lightning rod.
Well, Mike, every administration, let's face it, every administration has some clunkers that get proposed that, have trouble getting through the nomination process and don't get nominated and don't get approved and appointed to the office. But given the outrageousness of some of these nominations, I have to expect Larry Hogan will be nominated for a position, or is that just a pipe dream?
I think that's probably more of a pipe dream. I know that Mark has some thoughts otherwise, and I would struggle to see how, given the statements that former Governor Hogan has made, that he would either one, want to accept such a position, or two, be offered such a position if one were to be presented to him. But I'd be curious to see. And at this point, I'm just sitting back and watching and see where things go and how the pieces fall apart or fall together. And this is what people wanted, and so I think it'll be interesting to see what it presents.
Well, I pose that question with tongue in cheek because I think it's well known that it won't happen. But one of the interesting things that came out of this election was that, and the Baltimore Sun released this report, I believe, yesterday, was that the percentage of vote that President Trump received from Marylanders increased by 2.5% during this last election in 2024, as opposed to 2020. Is there any indication that Maryland is turning more right? Mark, I'll ask you.
Well, I think I looked at those numbers, and I think some of it was also on turnout among Democratic voters, which was not as strong as it was 4 years ago. Yes, I think there's that component, because obviously we also saw a number of specific demographics in which Trump did better. And I will go back, because I did want to correct you. There is a position for Larry Hogan in the administration, and actually ambassador to South Korea. So let me just go on record making that prediction. Happy to expand on that, but I'll just include it.
I think that becomes obvious because Mrs. Hogan is Korean and Korean descent, and that would be and there was a close relationship between South Korea and Maryland during the COVID,
right,
where we were reliant on supplies from Korea, and that relationship provided beneficial. So that would be an interesting appointment if that came through. I was also wondering about some of the other election races here in Maryland, Mike. We saw in the 6th District that April McClain Delaney was ultimately decided to have won that nomination. What do you think of her as our future congressperson?
I think she's got her work cut out for her. I think that she carried that district. I think to your point, I think Neil has shown that he can be a strong candidate there. I think he ran another strong race. I don't think she ran as strong a race as she probably as people were expecting. And I think that she got through. And so I think the challenge now is for her to really kind of buckle down and really what are the issues that she wants to focus on, and what does she want to bring to the 6th District? And I think that'll be curious to see how that unfolds in the coming weeks and months in light of how Congress is going to set itself up.
Mark, have you seen any of the election results from that race as to whether or not independents played a major role in that election?
Well, as you said, this has been a tightly contested race over the last since the lines were drawn. I was very surprised that this was not more broadly identified as being one of those toss-up rates. It had been identified, I think, in a lot of sites as being sort of leans Democrat, and I don't think it reflected just how close that race was going to be. As we've talked about before, it's one half of the district is overwhelmingly Republican, and the other half is Democrat, and it's a very few independents in the middle that ends up deciding that race. So those numbers, I think, suggest that for the balance of the decade, it will continue to be a very competitive race. Certainly, people are going to look at those numbers for 2026, and I think continue to focus on it as being one of those swing districts that decides who's speaker.
So did Neil Parrott have enough support from the Republican Congressional Committee? Did he get enough money? Was that the problem?
I don't think that there was enough support. I don't think there was a broad enough recognition as to how competitive that race would be.
And I think that went both ways. I'm not sure that April McClain Delaney got as much support as people anticipated she would be getting from the party either. So I think to your point, Mark, it's right. I was surprised that wasn't seen as highlighted more on the national scale, and it really wasn't, because I thought it was going to be a close race.
Mike, I'll take a contrarian view here. I mean,
really?
When you have a multi-millionaire, it's what a shock, right? When you have a multimillionaire running for her first time for office, and her husband another multimillionaire had been elected, people think they can self-fund. Why should they give them their money? And isn't that the problem with her candidacy?
Well, I think that was certainly a piece. I think that was a challenge, especially when you look at Congressman Trone and the amount of money that he spent. So I think whether you like it or not, and I wouldn't know because I don't have those types of resources, but I think once you pass a certain threshold, you're kind of thrown into the same camp, and I don't know if that's fair or not.
Well,
I think you raise a really
tonight is $370 million, Mike. Go buy a ticket.
So you raise an important point about District 6, which is how potentially expensive it is as a race. I mean, we think about it as being in the Washington TV market. It's also in the Pittsburgh television market. Right. So you could be spending a lot of money to to contest this.
Yeah, but don't you have to carve out those votes from Montgomery County if the Republican Party expects to win?
Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely, and that's where your costs are, right?
Yeah.
You can't do it all by internet ads, right?
Right.
I wouldn't think. All right. Well, this is a great wrap up. Stay tuned for parting shots when we come back from this short break.
When I first saw a turtle, my heart was full. Now anything but lonely.
We have this deep connection, this heart connection.
He just wants to be close to you and part of your life.
Every day with turtle is a perfect day.
When I'm holding her, it makes me feel calmer.
I think everything he does shows how much he loves us.
When we adopt a shelter pet,
We discover
they're a little bit of a lot of things.
But they're all pure
Pure
love.
love.
Welcome back. Now with parting shots, Mike Knapp.
Thanks, Casey. Well, we're finally through the election, and there's been lots of noise in lots of different directions. I'm hopeful that we can all begin to settle down now and really focus on how do we as a community come back together, and how do we take care of each other as we enter into this holiday season. And so it's an opportunity for a little bit of re-engagement and really understanding who your neighbors are again. And so I hope people take advantage of that.
Thank you, Mike. Mark Uncapher, your parting shot.
Well, a hat tip to Reardon Sullivan, who was the Republican candidate for county executive 2 years ago. But he was really the guy who was behind the ballot initiative for term limits for county executive, got the signatures, and it wouldn't have happened if it weren't for him. So hat tip for him for making the difference.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mike. I want to thank the audience for tuning in each and every week to Montgomery County's hardest hitting political talk show. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.